Now, when it comes to the histology of the esophagus, it is the easiest. I mean, it's easiest because it's a revision of the physiology lesson number 1. If you go to physiology, the overview is literally the same. Mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, in which it mentioned that the layers of the GIT tract, they were made of 4, right? Mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and adventitia or serosa, depending. And it said it's starting from the esophagus to the anus. They all contain the same 4 sublayers, but with some different characteristic any features. Like we're starting with the esophagus, all right? So when we go down, you'll see the 4 layers, very easy. There's going to be a difference, for example, in their epithelium. Starting with the esophagus, all right? So if we're going to start, let's just revise basically the physiology. Now remember, you remember the esophagus, Yesor? You remember the esophagus? Which is this long muscular tube? Tell me, do you think this makes sense for esophagus to be lined by simple columnar epithelium? No. The esophagus is not meant for digestion or absorption. It's exactly like you see it. It's a muscular tube whose purpose is literally to transport a bolus from the pharynx into the stomach. Thus, the epithelium that it should be lined by should be an epithelium that is durable, resist the damage from the abrasion of food. However, it's not as protective against acid, unfortunately, like you see in GERD. But the epithelium that lines the esophagus for protection and for secreting mucus too, not for stomach acid, mind you, for the abrasion against food, is stratified squamous. The epithelium that lines it is stratified squamous epithelium. Keratinized or non-keratinized? Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. That is the epithelium that lines your esophagus. Logic, all right? So if we go to the esophagus, that's the difference immediately. That's the difference immediately from your esophagus to your, let's say, your stomach and intestine, is that they're lined by an epithelium that is not found in the stomach. Okay? Because in the stomach and intestine, we're going to see they're lined by simple columnar epithelium, for instance. Okay? So that's immediately for the esophagus, which is divided into 4 layers. We said the mucosa is lined by what epithelium? Non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. And mucosa, meaning epithelium, was a lamina propria underneath. Revising for physiology, it also contains galt. Okay, the lamina propria is a thin, loose connective tissue containing galt, which stands for gut-associated lymphoid tissue. If you remember from physiology lesson 1. And underneath it is muscularis mucosa. This muscularis mucosa is a thin layer of smooth muscle responsible for movement of the mucosa, basically for helping in movement of the mucosa that it secretes, the mucus that it secretes, that is. Okay? So you got the muscularis mucosa. That is the mucosa of your esophagus, just like that. Now, what is underneath the mucosa? Your submucosa, taban. Because we just finished here. This is, of course, the small intestine, but you can imagine the esophagus without being folded, all right? Now, let's go to the submucosa. Now, here's the cool thing about the submucosa. It is a thick, dense, irregular connective tissue, okay? A thick, dense, irregular connective tissue. This is basically the tissue. This layer right here is the one that's responsible for giving any digestive tube this tensibility and elasticity. Meaning what? It means basically when food comes here, it basically makes sure that your intestine or your esophagus doesn't explode, all right? It's able to be distended, stretch it. But also make sure that's not permanently distended. It can be elastic, return back to its form once it pushes the food forward, propel it forward via peristalsis. So that's what the submucosa does. It contains this dense irregular connective tissue responsible for that. So the submucosa. And there's another exception you need to know for the esophagus. The esophagus, it is the only upper GIT along with the duodenum that contains glands in their submucosa. They contain submucosal glands. The duodenum and the esophagus, they're the only organs or the only digestive tubes in your upper GIT that contain glands in their submucosa. And those 2 glands that they have are basically mucus secreting glands. So in the case of the esophagus, the submucosal gland in the esophagus, I'm drawing on the small intestine, but you can imagine the esophagus, right? But in the submucosa, the gland that they have is called esophageal gland. They also have another gland, but we're not going to look into it. They're called cardiac glands, but we're going to focus on the esophageal gland. The esophageal glands, from their name, they're mucus-secreting glands. They secrete mucus so that when there's food coming down like a chip that you haven't eaten properly, it makes sure that the sharp edges of the chip doesn't cause erosions of the esophagus by secreting mucus, making it, lubricating it. Okay, they come from the esophageal glands located in the submucosa. And you know, like any other digestive tube, they contain a nerve plexus as well called the submucosal plexus. All right, so in the esophagus, they contain, along with the duodenum, they're the only ones that contain a gland in their submucosa. For the esophagus, it's called the esophageal glands, secreting mucus for protective and lubricating purposes. The other thing they contain is like any other digestive tube, اللي هي submucosal plexus. All right, that's the most important parts in the dense irregular connective tissue. The next one underneath it is the muscularis layer. Now the muscularis external layer, this is the layer responsible for contraction, therefore peristalsis and mixing movement. They contain of two layers. One layer is basically circling the lumen, known as the inner circular layer, and the other one is a layer that is lining the whole length of the digestive tube, calling the outer longitudinal layer. And in between these sublayers in the muscularis layer is the myenteric nerve plexus. My for muscle, enteric for intestine. So a nerve plexus found from their name within the muscularis layer of a intestine, all right, or within a digestive tube, okay? Now, I want you to keep in mind, when it comes to the esophagus, they actually contain both skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. So we cannot just say inner and outer longitudinal smooth muscle layer. No. Because your esophagus, they contain both depending on the region. So if I were to draw for you the esophagus, simply like here, the upper part of your esophagus, they're going to be lined by exclusively skeletal muscle. If you remember from the lesson 1 on physiology, they mentioned that motility is achieved by smooth muscle contraction except 3 parts. One of them was the early part of esophagus, which was lined by skeletal muscle. So the upper 1/3 of your esophagus lined by skeletal muscle. The middle is lined by a mixture of both skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. And the lower end of your esophagus is gonna be lined exclusively of inner and outer longitudinal smooth muscle layer. Again. So again, the esophagus is lined by skeletal muscle and smooth muscle layer, depending on the location. The upper end is exclusively skeletal muscle, okay? Exclusively. Lower end, exclusively smooth muscle layer. In the middle, a mixture of both smooth muscle and skeletal muscle layer, okay? So that's something to keep in mind. So that's for the muscularis layer. And now the final part, the most outermost layer is the serosa. Now, not just the serosa for the esophagus, but the adventitia. Let's look at it from a slide real quick. But for now, we're going to look at it in a slide of its own. But for now, you get the points, right? The mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, the features of not just our digestive tract, but the esophagus as well. All right? So let's revise it, what the esophagus contains. Of course, these are identification points for the OSPE to keep in mind, according to what Dr. Nimmer has said, for the OSPE to write in. So we get, again, the mucosa of the esophagus, they're lined by what? Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, with a lamina propria and a muscularis mucosa, sublayers. All right, like we can see right here, very thick stratified squamous epithelium. And here is the submucosa. If this is the mucosa, right, with the epithelium, the lamina propria and the muscularis mucosa, here is the submucosa, and you can see the presence of esophageal glands with excretory ducts. They're the ones that secrete mucus, to protect against the chip, for example, here, against the abrasion of food. So you can see these mucus acini of esophageal glands. They're the only ones besides the duodenum that have these in their submucosa. Okay? And of course, the muscularis layer, depending on which region, skeletal or less smooth muscle. Here's the outermost layer we're going to look into, the adipose tissue and serosa. They're lined by both, mind you, but depending on the location. Here's another picture as well. Easy, certified squamous epithelium, non-keratinized. And here's the submucosa. The most important thing you need to know, they contain the esophageal gland with their excretory ducts and the submucosal plexus. And by the way, the submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus that we're going to look into here in the muscularis externa, these together form your gut brain. They form your enteric nervous system, okay? As you know from lesson 1 of physiology, the overview that is, all right? So dense irregular connective tissue, and here's again, remember esophageal glands, the man was the muscularis layer. Here's the muscularis external layer, inner and outer longitudinal muscular layer, depending on the region. In between them is the connective tissue containing the myenteric plexus, as we can see right here, connective tissue containing them. Okay. And finally, we'll go to the outermost layer, serosa with adventitia. Now, your esophagus, they contain both adventitia and serosa, but depending on the location. So here's how you're going to draw it. You see here, we're going to draw here the esophagus, okay? Your esophagus is going to be lined by adventitia. The majority of it, they're all going to be lined by adventitia, which is a loose connective tissue, except the distal, yani the lower third of your esophagus. They're going to be lined by serosa. So, hold on. So, basically, your esophagus is lined by adventitia and serosa. All the parts of the esophagus, all of them are lined by the adventitia, the loose connective tissue, معدا the distal كده 1 to 2 centimeter, يعني the lower third of your esophagus, which is lined by serosa. Why? Because the lower third of your esophagus, they're present within the abdominal cavity. You see, anything that's present within the abdominal cavity, when they're squished around by digestive organs, they need to be lined by serosa. And you know the function of serosa, right, from physiology. Secretes serous fluid, so they can provide lubrication to prevent friction. All right, so that's why they're lined by serosa. But with the adventitia, on the other hand, lining your esophagus the majority of the time, their purpose is to basically connect your esophagus here into the stomach. All right, so that's the function of your adventitia, to literally attach your esophagus to the stomach. But the serosa, its purpose is to prevent friction between the esophagus and the stomach. All right, found only in the lower third of your esophagus, there's serosa. The majority or the remaining amount in your adventitia, or lined by adventitia. Okay. And the last thing just to keep in mind is, of course, the serosa. They are the connective tissue that is. It is lined by an epithelium, a simple squamous epithelium. We gave it a special name called the meso or the mesothelium. All right. Another feature to keep in mind for the serosa. Okay. They're both two loose connective tissue, but with two different functions. One is basically attach the esophagus to the stomach. The other is for lubricating purposes. Okay. One has an epithelium covering it. The other doesn't. اللي هي الادفنتيشن. Okay, الميزوثيليوم الكلام ده. And that's basically it. Like here, like we said, the upper esophagus, only adventitia. All right. Here in the lower esophagus, what are you gonna find? Serosa. You see the difference now? See the difference? Here's another part. Here's the thing I was talking about the muscular layer. The upper esophagus, the skeletal muscles, but the lower esophagus, smooth muscle. Okay, depending on the region you're talking about. And here's the gastroesophageal junction we're talking about. And here's the esophageal glands. All right, they're the only ones that have glands in their submucosa, معاد الدودنم, which has a gland called Berner glands. Memorize that name for when you look at part 2. Okay, and that's the end of histology. Knowing the 4 layers of the esophagus, you see some key differences, right, between the esophagus and the other remaining digestive tubes. All right, good luck in your revision, and thank you.